So anyway, let's get started. I was just saying, I know two of these three gentlemen very well. I hadn't met Joe Price before. He's an associate professor of economics at BYU. I know Jim Kushiner for a long time. He's a publisher of Touchstone magazine and Salvo magazine. And then Errol Naidoo was actually, I've known for years and years, and there was a time when he was a kind of a fellow or learning about some of the work we were doing in Washington, D.C. He's now back in South Africa. We set up his own Family Policy Institute. So I think Joe's going to go first. We're going to talk for, each of these guys will talk for 10 or 15 minutes. When we finish, then we'll take questions from you. So.
Great. I'm going to stand up just so I can speak better, but so actually just really quick, in terms of stats background, like if you're super stats up here, no stats down here, where are we? Just really quick. Okay, great. In terms of my background, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of social science research in policies related to the family. So my background is I was one of the expert witnesses for the same-sex marriage case in Michigan, along with Bart Regnerus, Lauren Marks, and Doug Allen. And so I want to share a little bit of the things I learned from that experience. And also, I think what's helpful in this is that we encounter research all the time. And our ability as citizens to process research and think about it is really important. And so I'm going to try to introduce a couple things that might help you as you encounter studies like that. So in the Michigan case, it was actually really helpful because the judge was super clear about what the question was. And it was a very simple question. It was, do child outcomes differ between children raised by same-sex couples and children raised by heterosexual couples? And what's really interesting is there have been a lot of studies in the past, and actually none of the authors of those studies served as expert witnesses. On the other side, the only person that had done their own study was Michael Rosenfeld, and his was actually a really important study. It was using the California Prop 8 case, and his sample size was actually larger than all the studies before put together. Okay? It was nationally representative. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about his study because I think his study was a quantum leap forward in the research. And I think he's a very careful scholar, but I'll show you that doing good research is hard. You have to pay attention to little details. You have to be careful about some statistical things. And so in a court case like the one that happened in Michigan, what's unfortunate is that you get to a case where you have to discuss these technical issues. And as a public, if we're not really kind of equipped to handle technical issues, we might actually miss some of the important points that are being made in the discussion. And another way to think about this question, so this is the way he phrased the question, but the way I like to think about the question is, do children need a father and a mother? Are there consequences of fatherlessness, motherlessness? And another way to think about it is, are fathers and mothers interchangeable? And so you're going to sometimes hear in the media will say, well, this new study found X, and they might say, okay, and this other study found Y, and you're looking at those two studies and you're wondering, okay, well, who's right? And so let me just teach you like 3 very simple things that you should just use as kind of a litmus test when you're looking at research. The first is about confidence intervals. Okay? As scientists, we're never certain, and so what we do is we try to put bounds on our certainty. And you see this a lot in elections. They'll say, we think Obama's going to win, but the margin of error is plus or minus 5. Okay, so I think we're all used to kind of that type of uncertainty. I'll talk a little bit about a representative sample, and we've all encountered this. Is that sometimes, if we go survey our friends, we might get a very mistaken notion of what's going on in our country, because the people around us are different than the nation as a whole. And then we'll talk a little bit about replication, which is the ability for other scholars to replicate what you found and then extend it in different ways. But before that, let me just mention really quick this thing called the no difference hypothesis. And this shows up in a lot of different cases. So in our case, it was that one of the claims being made was that there was no difference in child outcomes between same-sex couples and gender-diverse couples. But other claims were there's no difference in stability rates, parental gender doesn't matter, fathers and mothers are interchangeable. And what you're making is a claim that the outcomes of 2 groups are not going to be different from each other. Now the really challenging thing here is there's 2 ways that you can get a no difference. One is that there truly is no difference, or the other is that you don't have the statistical power to tell that there's a difference. And when you're looking at a really small group, sometimes the statistical precision can be a bit of a problem. And so when we think about the no difference hypothesis, rather than just saying we didn't find a statistical difference between the two groups, I think it's helpful to put a confidence interval around what the difference could be. And I'll show you an example of this in just a second. The other is that you really want to use a representative sample. And when you're studying certain groups like single fathers, or women that have had an abortion, or other things like that, these are really hard groups to find and identify. And so a lot of times what researchers use is things called convenience samples. Well, they'll just basically do the best you can. But unfortunately, you end up with a sample that might not be representative of the people you care about. And this has been particularly a problem when we're studying homelessness or other things. These are just really hard things to track. Now, the nice thing in this area is that there's two approaches. One is the Rosenfeld approach, which is you just start with an incredibly large sample to begin with. So he's using 1% of the US population. And if your sample's that big to begin with, then you're going to find some kids in there that were raised by same-sex couples. The other you can use the Regnerus approach, which is you specifically oversample kids at a certain time. Now, the third issue is replication. And replication is really the hallmark of science. And I tell my students all the time, if they bring some work to me, if I can't replicate what they did, then it's like they never did it. Okay? Because I never trust my students' work. And in some sense, that's because we treat students like this, but in fact, we should treat all of ourselves like this. Okay? So even as a scientist, if I show you some results, you should ask, hey, can I replicate that? Can I see your data? Can I see your code? Can I make sure that what you're finding is true? That's just how science works. And actually, the good studies in this area, like Rosenfeld, Regnerus, or Potter, they use data sets that can be easily accessed by any other scholar. Like one of the things I really admire about Mark Regnerus is he put his data out there right away. Basically invited the world to attack him. And that's like the best practice in science, because actually when people attack a study, it highlights weaknesses and other things. And then you try to remedy those and you try to make the science better. Now what's unfortunate is in the 59 studies cited by the APA, you simply cannot get the data. Like I've emailed authors and I said, hey, could I please use your data? No, you cannot use my data. Can I come to your university and sit in a special computer lab? No, you can't do that. Okay? So that's not good science. And so what we wanted to do was take the Rosenfeld study, which had found that there was no difference between children raised by same-sex couples and children raised by heterosexual couples. Because, first of all, it was the best study of its type, larger than all the other samples put together, but also because we could easily access his data. And he's a good scholar. Like, he was willing to share his code with us. We had done it ourselves. We wanted to make sure we're doing it exactly the same way he did. And so in this case, it's kind of a perfect replication. So now this is where it's going to get slightly technical. And I had to be technical with the judge as well, because the thing is there's no way around this. What I'm going to show you is inherently tricky to do, and it's in the details that the differences emerge. And understanding the details is super important. So what I'm going to show you first is I'm just going to show you the table from the original Rosenfeld paper. And there's three aspects of it that make it a little harder to interpret. So this is the table. You're probably already you're like, there's stars and numbers. So this is a logistic regression. So one thing you should know is you have an omitted group, which is sexual, married, and then they're comparing other family structure groups to that group. So when you see this negative coefficient, and the outcome here is whether or not you're making normal progress in school. It's an important measure of future life outcomes. So that negative coefficient with the little star, what that means is that children being raised by same-sex couples are less likely to be making normal progress in school, and this difference is statistically significant. That's what the star means. But then their point is as you put controls in, the star disappears. Okay, now stars are important, because we do want to test to see if things are statistically different. But to me, magnitudes are even more important. And so some of the things missing from this table is an interpretable magnitude. Those numbers I cannot interpret to you. They're logistic coefficients. You can run them through a little formula and get something that means something, but they don't help you right away. And the other thing is there's no standard errors. And standard errors are what you use to get confidence intervals. So I have no idea. I don't know how big the confidence intervals on these are. So let me just show you that. So all I did, and the other thing is that all of those other stars, like on Never Married Women, those are all compared to heterosexual married couples. So one thing we know is that actually children raised by heterosexual married couples do much better than almost any other family structure type. Now, what you can do, so here's one quick thing you can do, is you can flip who you're going to compare it to. So instead of using the heterosexual married as the comparison group, you can make the same-sex couples the comparison group. And now when you look at stars, what's that telling you? Is this group different than the same-sex married group? And so here's a key issue, if I can point to it. Right here, okay, right here you have never married women. Okay, you've got this negative 0.151, and it's got stars on it. That's because they're doing worse than heterosexual married couples. When you flip it, so now the omitted group is the same-sex couple. Are any of these groups different from that? And what you're finding is that actually children raised by same-sex couples are not statistically different than any group. Okay, so the headline was that there was no difference between children raised by same-sex couples and children raised by heterosexual married couples. But they could have said that there was no difference between children raised by same-sex couples and single mothers, a group that we know is disadvantaged for children. Okay, so who you compare yourself to is really important in terms of how you convey the message to others. Now let me just show you magnitudes. So now I'm going to translate this into a number that actually means something. So that 1.15, the 1.5 of it tells you that a child raised by a heterosexual married couple is 15% more likely to be making normal progress in school. And I can put a confidence interval on there. And so even though it's not statistically significant, I know that it's somewhere between they're doing about 10% worse to they're doing about 47% better. Okay, so that's a big confidence interval. And so the question is, can we shrink it? Can we shrink the kind of cone of truth? And so one thing that happened in the original study is he threw away a lot of children. So he said you had to be biologically related to the household head, and you had to have lived in the same house for 5 years. Okay? Now there's some reasons why he did that, okay, and I can sympathize, but the other consequence of this is you're throwing away half the children in the sample. And you're actually eliminating 2 of the mechanisms through which having same-sex parents can affect children: biological relatedness and stability. So all we're going to do is, there's that 1.15 I showed you earlier. All we're going to say is, hey, let's just drop one of those restrictions and see what happens. Let's drop another restriction, or let's drop both restrictions. And if you look across the bottom, that's what's happening to your sample size. So if you get rid of the restriction that you have to live in the same house for 5 years, you double your sample size. Okay, now you find that the difference is even bigger. It's about 25%, and now it's statistically significant. Okay, and same thing if you do other things. And this is what I mean, that sometimes the importance is in the details. Like thinking carefully about, okay, why did I drop half the kids from my sample? Did that make sense? What if I done it a different way? And there's nothing wrong with thinking, okay, I think the answer is 15%, but I think the most important thing from a public policy perspective is to show the other ways you can think about it. Now there was one other little technical issue, which is that this measure, actually I won't even talk about this. This is like an even more technically detailed thing, but it's about an issue of measurement here. But let me just kind of finish by just talking a little bit about why I think this is important. I don't want to bore you with like technical science stuff, but if you enjoy that, I would love to have a conversation with you about some of the technical science stuff. But what was kind of a disappointing part of the Michigan case, regardless of the outcome, was that the judge in this case determined that the supporters of traditional marriage were fringe scientists. And what's interesting is I don't think actually we should think about fringe scientists in terms of the size of the group they belong to, because we are a small group. We're getting bigger. But it's about how closely you adhere to the principles of the scientific method in terms of using representative samples, allowing others to replicate your work. And the other thing that we need to acknowledge is that when we try to study groups like this, it's a really small group. There's only about 170,000 kids in this country being raised by same-sex couples. You've maybe found a different number, like 2.7 million. And if you want, I can tell you about where that number comes from, and that's a whole other interesting story. But it's actually about 7 times smaller than the number of kids being raised by single fathers, which is a group that we've always had a hard time studying. Like we've almost given up. We're like, oh, we can't even study single fathers because it's such a small group. Well, this is 7 times smaller. And what we need to be super careful is that I think in the desire that some groups had to kind of speed up the process towards same-sex marriage, they had to make scientific statements that could actually be disastrous in child custody cases for heterosexual couples. Like if we actually collectively begin to agree that biological relatedness doesn't matter, that fathers and mothers are interchangeable, that stability doesn't matter, those could have very serious consequences for child custody cases across the other 99.5% of kids that live with a mother and father. And then I think that actually what we need to do is move towards a child-focused policy where we think of the child as the primary target of our research and think carefully about what it is that children are entitled to. And I think it'll get us to think carefully about the importance of fidelity, permanence, and the kind of things that help children flourish. Stop there. I could take one question now, but I think we're going to do the other questions. Yeah.
Okay, just real quickly. So you had one outcome measure about
making normal progress in
through
school.
So in that particular study, how many outcome measures were there?
That's the only outcome measure that you can use in the census data. So in the regular study, you have 20 outcomes. In the census, you only have one. And so one thing I did was I set up everything exactly the same way Rosenfeld did.
Okay.
And so that's the outcome you use. It's the only one available in that data set. So you trade off, you have a huge sample. It's a big sample of any study. But the trade-off is you only get to look at the one outcome, which is making normal progress in schools. There's always trade-offs.
Okay, my name's Errol Naidoo. You're going to have to listen carefully. I've got a strange accent. That's because I'm from Cape Town, South Africa. I had an organization called Family Policy Institute. We work to promote a family-centered philosophy of life, working with our parliament, our government, with church, and through the media. I'm obviously going to talk a little bit different from my colleague in that I'm tell you the story of South Africa since we became a democracy about 21 years ago, 1994. Maybe many of you will know that South Africa was an apartheid state for a good number of years, and then in 1994 we had a democratic election, and I was able to vote for the first time in my life, 33 years old, which was a great day. And what happened was we had a lot of oppressive laws, and a little hocha jumped on my head there. And the new government that came in, the ANC government, decided that they were going to get rid of everything that was associated with the previous government, the National Party government. So they threw the baby, the bath water, the bath, the soap, the shampoo, everything they threw out. So as a nation, we went from one extreme to the other. From a very, very repressive society, we became a very, very liberal society. And I don't think our nation was prepared for that. And so I want to talk about, we're talking about pro-family scholarship and research, and there was none of that in South Africa. And still, we have very little of it. So I'm a huge proponent of research and social data, and that's why I'm part of the World Congress of Families and a lot of other American and European organizations, because we tend to get a lot of research and social data through those organizations. It helps us, but not that much, because we're talking about America, we're talking about Europe, we're not talking about South Africa. So what happened in 1994 is that the lack of pro-family research and scholarship and data significantly contributed to the formulation, moral justification, and eventual passing of a raft of anti-family legislation in South Africa since the advent of democracy in 1994. In 1996, the choice of termination of pregnancy or abortion on demand bill was signed into law by then President Nelson Mandela. You will be familiar with that name. And even though the legislation was passed in our parliament by primarily the ANC majority, the public opposition to that legislation was overwhelming against in opposition to abortion on demand. And today, if you did a survey in South Africa on support for abortion on demand, you get about 83% of people that is vehemently opposed to it. It's a kind of nation. where most of the people are opposed to a policy, and we have it in the country. And so, despite the outcry, the pro-abortion lobby was a lot better organized to push this through. It looks like they were in training even during the apartheid years, so when democracy came, they were ready to push through their argument. Unfortunately, the pro-life movement in South Africa was in its infancy and wasn't prepared with credible pro-life research and data to counter the arguments being made by the pro-abortion movement. And of course, they were helped along by the media that amplified everything they said. And it's the same stories in South Africa, still the same. So, as a result, the most extreme abortion legislation was passed in South Africa. Girls as young as 12 years old are not required to consult their parents before having an abortion in South Africa today. Counseling and ultrasound scans are also not mandatory. In fact, a teenage girl can walk into an abortion clinic and demand an abortion, which the taxpayer has to pay for, and she can have that abortion. And because of this kind of policy, this liberal and extreme policy in South Africa, abortion is now used as a contraceptive. We now have nurses in our abortion clinics going for counseling because they witness 15-year-old girls walking into abortion clinics, sometimes up to 3 times in 1 year. Recent media reports reveal that a teenage girl in the Eastern Cape province, is one of the provinces, we have 9 in South Africa, a teenage girl in the Eastern Cape province has an abortion every 10 minutes. So almost 2 decades later, the pro-life movement is armed with limited research and social data on the consequences of the abortion holocaust. In other words, we still don't have enough research, credible research and social data to fight this case. And so we would go to Parliament, make any argument, show us the research, the social data, there's none. Because nobody's doing it. And so we would quote America, we would quote Europe, and it doesn't really apply there, so it doesn't help us. So that's on the abortion issue. Then on the same-sex marriage issue, same-sex marriage was legalized in 2006 after a lesbian couple took their case to the Constitutional Court of South Africa, which is the equivalent of the US Supreme Court. And in our constitution, our new constitution, democratic constitution, sexual orientation is protected. It's in the constitution as a protected class. You cannot discriminate against anybody on the basis of sexual orientation. So the lesbian couple went and said, the Marriage Act says man and woman, and so we discriminated. The court agreed and asked our parliament to correct the defect. There was a defect and they had to correct it. And the parliament had 1 year to deal with this issue. And then you see that homosexual activists began working on the redefinition of marriage almost immediately after democracy. In 1994, they were ready. They had millions of rands, South Africa, at their disposal. They had teams of lawyers ready to go. So was democracy. And they used the argument, we were oppressed in the past under apartheid. We now demand our human rights and our freedom and equality like people of color. So they compared their sexual orientation to skin color, with people like me that were oppressed because of my skin color, and they said, well, as homosexuals we are oppressed, we demand their freedom. And I know somebody here in America said don't compare your sin to my skin. So the Marriage Alliance was formed. A number of churches, evangelical churches, Catholic churches got together and formed the Marriage Alliance to oppose this, to protect the biblical definition of marriage between man and woman. I acted as the national coordinator. I wrote the submission to our parliament. I delivered it on behalf of the Christian church in South Africa. But because of our constitution, our parliament had to legalize same-sex marriage. So instead of what they were pushing for was to redefine the Marriage Act so that it included the word spouses rather than man and woman or man and wife. But the church won that battle in that we didn't want the Marriage Act amended, and so our parliament just merely created a new piece of legislation called the Civil Union Bill. Again, on this issue, we lacked credible research and social law. And what we lacked the research on was how important marriage is to society and how important it is to children, the development of children, having a mom and a dad. We had little to no research on that issue, so we couldn't present anything. So our argument then basically rested on our religious opposition and the fact that marriage is an institution given by God, and no human institution has the authority to amend it or redefine it. But the homosexual lobby was prepared for that argument. They were prepared for almost anything and everything. And they said, well, we want civil marriages. We don't have to have religious marriages. And we get married in the court has nothing to do with the church, and the church is not impacted. So that also helped us in that no Christian or religious minister is required to conduct a same-sex marriage. You're not forced to do that. If you want to, there are some churches that do. You have to actually go and apply to be a marriage officer in a same-sex marriage ceremony. And so we lacked the research. And so the Civil Union Bill was passed in the South African Parliament on December 2006. Again, I did the presentation in our Parliament, and I got a summary of all the presentations done on the issue of the Civil Union Bill, and 91% of South Africans oppose same-sex marriage under any circumstances. I repeat, 91% of South Africans oppose same-sex marriage. The ANC members of Parliament, were the majority, were instructed to vote that bill through or lose their job. And so they voted that through, and South Africa, I think, ceased to be a democracy on that day in 2006. And so almost a decade later, in South Africa's social experiment with marriage has borne better fruit. Today, in post-apartheid democratic South Africa, only 35% of children live with both biological parents. 35. Only 35% of children live with both biological parents. The vast majority live with single mothers. There's about 600,000 children that live in child-headed homes. There's no parent, no mother, no father. The oldest child is the parent in that home. 600,000 and growing because both parents have died of HIV/AIDS. Single-parent families and fatherless homes have wreaked havoc on the nation's social landscape. Most of South Africa's social ills can be traced back to family breakdown. Sexual immorality skyrocketed in South Africa in response to the new democratic government's liberal attitude towards human sexuality. The moral decline is described as alarming by both conservative and liberal social commentators. Even the liberals are saying what is happening in South Africa is alarming. It's cause for great concern because our teenage pregnancy rates are now off the charts. They cannot deal with it. The government are tearing their hair out. They don't know how to address the issue. The church in South Africa is, we're half asleep. So we have major problems on this issue. In August this year, the South African government amended the Sexual Offences Act, effectively decriminalizing sexual relations between children in the age group 12 to 16 years old. This followed an earlier constitutional court ruling. Sexual relations between children of increasingly younger ages have reached crisis proportions in South Africa. Many are exposed to hardcore pornography on the internet. As a result, child-on-child sexual abuse is increasing at alarming rates. The Constitutional Court relied heavily on so-called expert testimony from liberal law professionals at the University of Cape Town. their testimony asserted that children experimenting with sex at early ages are a normative part of their development. Consequently, criminalizing what is normal was deemed obviously wrong. So they said, so the court took that testimony and decriminalized sexual relations between children between the ages of 12 and 16 years old, effectively giving a green light to these young children to have sexual relations. Family Policy Institute, the organization I head, was one of the many pro-family organizations opposing this dangerous policy change. However, again, we lacked research and credible social data regarding the devastating impact of family breakdown on young children. And that's why our court relies on the universities, and unfortunately, most of the universities in South Africa are liberal and controlled by liberal elites. So well organized and well funded. So now that's on the homosexual issue and the liberal attitude to human sexuality. That's the impact and consequences in our country. Then there's a well organized and well funded pro-prostitution lobby group called the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Task Force, or SWET. And they're currently working to convince our government to decriminalize the entire sex industry in South Africa. The arguments they use are the same arguments used by discredited organizations in the Netherlands or parts of Australia and Germany. Sweat argues the only real way of protecting the human rights of sex workers, as they call prostitutes, is by decriminalizing the entire sex industry. Now this, of course, is the most extreme thing you can do, because you make a legitimate businessmen of brothel owners and pimps and crime syndicates that exploit and prey on vulnerable women and children. But the anti-exploitation groups in the nations that have decriminalized or legalized prostitution prove it doesn't work. In fact, they argue that a legalized sex industry is a gift to pimps, brothel owners, and crime syndicates. Evidence emerging from the Netherlands sex industry and from Australia and Germany indicate that a decriminalized sex trade does nothing to protect the human rights of women and girls trapped in prostitution. In fact, sex trafficking increased alarmingly in these nations. In addition, in almost all cases where the adult sex trade was legalized, child prostitution increased. The authorities in most cases lose control of the sex industry in their countries as crime syndicates move in under cover of the legal provisions provided by the state to spread their tentacles and manipulate the system. Despite this evidence, Sweat still argues that a decriminalized sex industry in South Africa is the solution to the abuse and exploitation suffered by women and children trapped in prostitution. Now, South Africa has very, very high rates of unemployment and poverty, so if you decriminalize the sex industry, I leave that to your imagination what would happen in my country. There's very little credible research or social data regarding prostitution or sex trafficking in South Africa. When anti-trafficking legislation was being finalized in the South African Parliament in 2013, liberal politicians argued that trafficking was not a major crime, so they discourage a waste of resources on this issue. The primary reason liberal politicians and others are unconvinced about the threat of human trafficking in South Africa is because there's no statistics on this crime. I met with our Deputy Minister of Justice, who actually said to me in his office, we don't have any research or data on sex trafficking, so we don't know how big this crime is in our nation. I know it because I work with organizations that protect women from trafficking and from exploitation. Women that actually rescue, organizations that actually rescue women out of trafficking situations, and they say it's a growing crime in our country. Our police do not know how to deal with it, address it. We have the legislation in place, but the implementation of the legislation is a huge problem. So sex trafficking is a huge threat and a growing threat because there's a number of foreign organizations coming into South Africa and operating there, bringing women in from poorer nations into South Africa and taking women out. But our government has no data, no intelligence, and so as far as they're concerned, it's not really a problem. In fact, I had to fly to Copenhagen in Denmark in 2010 to meet with a woman by the name of Gunilla Ekberg, She's a Swedish global expert on prostitution and its links to human trafficking. And Ms. Ekberg, who pointed out to me that she's not a Christian, she's a feminist, that she will still agree to help us in South Africa using a considerable expertise and knowledge on the global crime of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. And we're waiting for the policy or the legislation to get to our parliament. I'm going to fly her down to South Africa, and hopefully her expert testimony is going to help us sway our parliament to put policy in place that's going to protect women rather than just open floodgates. So I am therefore an active proponent of increased pro-family research and scholarship in South Africa. And we're asking people to help us. There are many that's coming to our aid. The pro-family movement has lost much ground in South Africa because we cannot back up our arguments with good research and social data, and the liberal left in South Africa appear to have all kinds of information at their fingertips, but we're struggling. However, more research is beginning to emerge to support the pro-family position, and surprisingly the source of a lot of the evidence we need is the government departments we are trying to convince. The Department of Social Development recently commissioned a study on the status of the family in South Africa. The results shocked many, including the government that commissioned it. The government's white paper on the family revealed that family dysfunction was the root cause of most of the nation's social ill. For example, 65,500 women are raped annually in South Africa, sexually abused, 65,500 women in 1 year. And of that 65,500 women, that's the most recent stats from South African Police Services, only between 5 and 8% of the perpetrators are arrested and prosecuted. That means 92% of abusers and rapists of women are walking free in our streets. They can repeat their crime over and over again. South African government doesn't appear to have a clue on how to address many of the serious problems in society. But you and I know that the solution lies with the family. Defend, protect, and strengthen the natural family unit, and will strengthen the moral fiber of the nation. And we actually see the more family breaks down in South Africa, the more crime increases, the more sexual abuse increases, the more children are exposed, becoming vulnerable to pornography and sexual abuse. And the last report we got from the police in South Africa is more than 25,000 children are sexually abused in South Africa. More than 25,000. So the evidence that we have that supports our argument, the only evidence we can give is that the Judeo-Christian value system is the only system capable of sustaining and enhancing family life. But we must have the courage and the will to boldly proclaim this truth. The natural family is the building block of society, and it deserves all the attention, focus, and the resources of government and civil society to ensure a strong, stable, and prosperous nation. And that is the work we do at Family Policy Institute. So we're working with our government, with Parliament, we do submissions, and we gather research, and we present it to our Parliament to convince them that the only way we're going to solve the problems facing, the enormous problems facing South Africa today, is that we begin focusing on the family. We strengthen the family unit, we reverse all of these trends, because government is sitting with a welfare problem where they're spending billions and billions and billions of welfare, and that welfare budget is increasing every year because as the family breaks down, the more people are dependent on it. So we in a critical situation, I believe, in South Africa, and it all comes down to the fact that we've turned our back on common sense and all the value systems that we know to be true. Our government has followed this whole Western European liberal mindset, and it's not working in South Africa. We're the only African nation on the continent of Africa to pass all these laws. All the other African nations in Africa have held fast. They're protecting family, protecting marriage, protecting children. South Africa does not belong on the continent of Africa anymore. We should be moved next to the Netherlands or somewhere up there. It's just not an African nation, and we desperately want to get back to Africa.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going last. So I'm James Kushiner, and I'm the editor of Touchstone and Salvo magazines. I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I won't be presenting a lot of social research and kind of drilling down into numbers. I am a journalist, and I've been specifically tasked to talk about how to reach college students, intellectual approach to reaching college students. What is, the good of research? What do we do with it? I mean, that's an important question. Whether we know it or not, I think most of us are research and data junkies. Today, you cannot watch television or surf the internet for very long without being confronted by the latest findings of a new scientific study or survey. Caffeine increases risk of high blood pressure 37%, researchers find. I'm just making that up. You may as well, I've heard so many different numbers over the years. Women over 50 who use a new drug are 2.5 times more likely to exhibit Y or Z symptoms. Perhaps someday a researcher will discover the effects of second-hand caffeine, and that people who live near Starbucks are 2.5 times more likely to arrive on time for work. Political candidates look to tracking polls and surveys with the devotion of pilgrims consulting the oracle at Delphi. Baseball team managers crunch numbers to decide who should pinch hit next. We use research to answer questions. We use research to pose new questions. Why is this happening? And we ask another question. We are fundamentally creatures who ask questions and search for answers. I think that says something about our existential situation in the cosmos. Since the fall, we have become lost, and we sense something is wrong. A lot of our research is addressed at fixing things that we realize are not good. Sometimes they're fixing things that our choices and behavior have affected. So we have bad outcomes, as in the case of South Africa. There's no research, so we say, obviously there's something going wrong. We've got to find out what's going on. Unfortunately, not all research is benign. We know about research done on prisoners by the Nazis and the Japanese during World War II in the prisoner of war camps. And then there was the so-called research done pretty much around the same time, in the late 40s, in our own backyard by so-called Dr. Al Kinsey of Indiana. So we do research on products, we do research on politics, on sports, we do research on people and behaviors, but research can be good and bad. Mr. Kinsey, Dr. Kinsey, for those of you who don't really know, I mean, he sexually experimented on children under the age of 1 and got away with it. Should have been arrested and put in prison. And I don't even want to get into that, but Salvo magazine is what I publish, and we specialize in presenting facts and telling stories about bogus research and good research. Research is a tool then that can help good men investigate questions and shed light on issues. Take the question of why birth rates have declined since the 1960s. There are many factors, and I'm not going to go into all of these, but here's one that just occurred to me in the last several years, and I've not really seen research done on it, but here's a possible issue or question. The national U.S. cesarean section rate was 4.5% in 1965 when it was first measured. With the 2007 rate at 31.8%, about 1 mother in 3 now gives birth by cesarean section, a record level for the United States. I think in Chicago that was even higher at some point in the late 70s, but, and I've heard that in private I've read that studies which in private hospitals in Brazil, there are places where the cesarean rate is as high as 80%. Now, okay, the question is, after looking at that data, is what does that do to a woman's desire, for the husbands as well, to have a second child? And how does that affect fertility? It's going to have some effect. And what about her friends? The more cesareans are out there, there's a sevenfold increase. Word of mouth is that childbirth is really dangerous and it's really a hassle and high risk of cesarean rate. Anyway, that's just a little sample of research that asks questions or probes questions. Salvo magazine was founded in 2006 to engage with the empirical studies, research, and facts that, and use them to discuss various issues of concern to those who defend the natural family. So we are a very pro-family, pro-life, pro-marriage magazine, and we use facts to fight so-called facts. For example, the ludicrous claim that was based on Kinsey that 10% of the population is gay. A recent survey showed that the average guesstimate of people, if you person on the street, the average was 25%. That's a general average. People think 25% of the population is gay. Imagine what that does to the debate on gay marriage. The real percent is 2%, 2.5. I've seen different numbers on it, but it's it's 1/10 of what was originally cited. This is this is a sidebar from Salvo magazine that just shows some facts on the difference between men and women. And again, this is research that is shown. The first bullet point, boys and girls are equally prone to depression until age 13. From that point forward, females produce higher levels of stress hormones. Well, I'm not going to read through all of these things. There's so much research, and I've heard so much at this conference. This conference is a wonderful treasure trove of research, and very, very scintillating discussions and insight on support of the family. So I'm not going to go through a lot of those particular things. This is just an example that we do in the magazine, what we call fact finds. And we just put them out there for young readers. We do target young readers, college age, young adults, and even high school. For example, a study done by the Yorkshire Building Society has found that women and men experience the pain of divorce differently, with women better than men at dealing with all stages of breakup. Again, that probably doesn't surprise most of us anecdotally who know couples that have divorced or friends that have divorced, but men do experience it. Well, this is something that can be studied. We study everything. Sometimes study is a good thing, and we point this out. Another study here, Rutgers University, calls attention to the independent influence of fathers on the emotional health of adolescents. It indicates that the well-being of a child is a function of the contributions of not just mothers or fathers, but of both kinds of parents, among other things. Tammy Vidian's research suggests that same-sex parenting shortchanges the developing child. This one is on maternal employment. This is not a very welcome study, but maternal employment during a child's adolescence reduces academic grades, regardless of whether that child is a boy or a girl. And contrary to popular opinion, Baum found that the effect of maternal employment on children in high school is no less detrimental in higher income families. We are awash in a sea of research, and there's so much information out there that one can hardly keep track of it. It all seems to point in one direction, that the natural family is the best environment for children, period. There shouldn't really even be a debate on it. unfortunately it has to be. British pupils attending private faith-oriented schools are about 1 year ahead academically of those at state schools, the study suggests. According to the London-based National Institute of Economic and Social Research, students who are of the lowest ability enjoy the most significant relative advantage. This is true in Chicago as well, where the average amount of money spent per pupil in the private school system, largely Catholic with some Lutheran schools, is much lower than public schools, but the achievement rates are much higher. Now, speaking of schools, we should talk about an intellectual strategy for reaching students using scholarship and research. First, let me say that pro-life, pro-family scholarship that addresses the sort of questions we looked at should, of course, be encouraged. Let the social scientists do their work, study the real effects of the sexual revolution, if they dare. But not all scholarship and research is welcome. Take Mark Regnerus's research and work that you've done. And you gave us a really wonderful summary of that and how he was pilloried for the work that was done on the children of same-sex parents and how they compare with children of male and female parents. So I'm the kind, because I'm a journalist, I like to go back and ask deeper questions. I like to go in through the back door of things. So, okay, what do we mean by scholarship? What is scholarship? Most of us think of scholarship as the main business of a school. Okay, we get that. The words, but truly radical scholarship is something that you have to look at as the origin of the words, of the roots. It comes from scholastes in the Greek. Scholar and scholarship are rooted in the ancient Greek concept of skole, which is the word for leisure, in the sense of having the time to study and discuss ideas and questions of importance. So the people that have the leisure to do this, debate the great questions, the philosophical questions, were attended the skole in word, the scholastes. Research, what does that mean? Among scholastics, research involves closely studying a matter and searching for information that has a bearing on the question or matter at hand. The word itself comes from the Middle French, to seek out, to search closely, which is based and rooted in the Latin secare, to go about, to wander, to traverse, which is related to the word circle and circus. Well, if you think about it, a search party will often begin at a certain point. Let me move back to this slide here, so I'm still on research. A search party will begin at a certain point and move in larger and larger circles until they find what they are looking for. If you combine this idea of searching, of going where you need to go, and also having the time that's required to make the search, then you have a better idea of what true scholarship and research ideally should be like. They require time and space and freedom and leisure to find evidence and to follow it wherever it goes until all the questions are answered. But as we know, it's often opposed, shut down, not funded, censored. But true research and scholarship has to have freedom with it. Does this describe the true state of affairs at the modern academy? Are both faculty and students allowed to openly investigate and debate questions of great human interest to follow the evidence wherever it leads? Or is it the case that our academies have become what many describe as politically correct campuses, indoctrination centers? Instead of re-education camps, do we have re-education campuses? Our re-education campuses, we did a little sidebar almost 10 years ago now on just the worst curriculum for the year 2006 to 2007. The colleges listed, and I don't want to go through them now, but they're really absurd courses. One of them is called The Adultery Novel. That's a great literature course. Imagine paying for that and going into debt over that. These course offerings are not designed to answer any of the great questions of the ages, nor are they designed to connect students with the greatest thinkers of the past. In fact, they are not even designed to answer questions that the students themselves would have come up with on their own. They have a cultural and sexual deconstruction agenda written all over them. Some deranged faculty members propose these ideas to their department heads for approval and receive them. Ironically, the indoctrination may harm, irritate, or confuse students, but it does not always succeed in removing from students a deep hunger for something more transcendent than what is available on the campus. Consider this survey. The Skeptical Inquirer, now there's a scientific organization for you, conducted a poll of 439 college students, discovered that seniors and graduate students are more likely than most Americans to believe in haunted houses, psychics, telepathy, and other metaphysical phenomena. Modeled after a nationwide Gallup poll taken in 2001, the study suggests that as people attain higher educational levels, the likelihood that they will believe in a transcendent realm increases. Well, there's a research paper. Why is that so? Well, to me it says, without doing the research, that the students are looking for something transcendent because it's in there and they sense it. And school has not removed it from them. Man is both body and soul. There is a higher aspirations, and even facts and research can often point to those higher aspirations. We do not always act according to our best interest, even when we know the facts. Drug addiction is just one example of that. Another thing we do in the magazine is something we call the casualty report, facts. The last one was on abortion. This one is on STD, facts on STD, the different kinds of diseases, the numbers, the percentages of students and young children that have contracted these diseases. The numbers are staggering if you just compare them to the 1960s. Something's going on, something's gone wrong. So we present those kinds of facts as well. Facts are not always persuasive. This is important to know, and talking about a strategy for college students. Facts alone do not persuade in every case. We are more than data, we are more than information, we are more than facts. We are persons with stories to hear and tell. Those are sometimes more powerful than even facts. We reach college students when we touch their deepest spiritual aspirations. This may require presenting facts, but also it requires honesty, personal witness, and especially love for the student. Like students, we've all left home, intent on learning good and evil for ourselves, and we've left the Father. In our present hedonistic, materialistic consumer society, we all too often live for today. In a far country or on a campus, many have lost their way, focused on the moment, not realizing that their livelihood comes from others. They're living off the capital of the Father or of our civilization, the moral capital that has built the society. But like prodigals, we're spending it. Now, here is a research rediscovery. The prodigal son, recall the story, is in the pigsty, feeding on pig food. Now, two facts emerge as he comes to himself. One, I am starving. Number two, my father is not. So he comes up with a strategy. Does he repent? Does he love his father? Does it matter? He goes home. It pointed him in the right direction. He rediscovers his father. His father recovers him. He will spend the rest of his life recalling the search that he was on, and also losing his way and being found. But he will also know that in the end, he mattered to someone. And the script of the prodigal son with the happy ending could be written 1,000 different ways at many stages along the journey home. Imagine a script where when he's in the far country at the bar partying up, there's somebody he meets who befriends him who says, I've been through all this. This is hell. You don't want to go there. Go back to your home. Maybe he might even persuade the young man to do that. Or when he went, when he lost all his funds, I mean, you can trace the route of this young man. At any point, there could have been a conversation. There could have been a conversation from the older brother before he even left home. Say, what are you doing? And maybe it would have been persuasive. At any point in that arc of that story, there could be facts, there could be research, realizations. Every story is different. The way we reach conversion is different for every person. There's no one script. Every soul is utterly unique in the universe. And I think when college students realize that, then they realize, then we've reached them. So that's my take on research.